Thank you so much, Anne. And it's great to hear a bit of a longer passage, because sometimes we can just read out a very small passage. It's lovely to have more of the Word of God read out in church sometimes. And before I start, let's just pray. Lord, would you help us all to learn how to follow after you more courageously, and how you want to use each of us to do extraordinary things for you. Amen. Well, today we begin a new series, The Heroines of the Old Testament. You see, the Old Testament is often accused of being a collection of books written by men, for men, and all about men. And I realize I am a man up here starting this series. But I hope as we look closer together the next 5 Sundays into these 5 accounts of 5 different women from the Old Testament, some of which are famous and others overlooked, we can see that these accounts are far more than just a man's world. And we can ask what these women and these accounts can teach us about God and about navigating challenges and about following Jesus. Each of these talks will be standalone, so if you're jumping in between weeks, don't worry, but they will connect with this overarching theme. And today we start with Esther. But before we jump into the book of Esther, I'm going to run and get my pointer. Before we jump into the book of Esther, let's do something that we don't often do. And let's zoom out and remind ourselves of the bigger picture of the Bible up until this point. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. God created the universe, planet Earth, and everything on it, including humans who he made in his image. And he saw all that he made, and it was good. The people were living in harmony with God in this home, Eden, the perfect paradise, and they had free reign, but just one thing, that they didn't eat from this one tree. But they disobeyed God and were banished into exile from the garden. The Bible then follows the story of one family, Abraham's family, who God chose not because they were strong or great, but exactly because they weren't. God promised Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and that the whole earth would be blessed through his family. God was using this family as a part of his rescue plan for humanity. Through a series of events, they then end up in slavery. Not a great start to this rescue plan, seemingly, but God then spectacularly breaks them out of Egypt and slavery and brings them into the promised land. A new Eden where God and man can be back together in harmony, with God dwelling among them. But the Israelites disobey again. And eventually they're sent into another kind of exile as the Babylonian Empire takes over the land. We then reach the book of Esther. 100 years after Babylonian exile, another superpower, the Persian Empire, had taken over, and God's people remained scattered across the world in exile and feeling far from God. This, then, is where we reach the story of Esther, a Jew, an Israelite living in the capital of the Persian city, of the Persian Empire, Susa. She is an orphan, but was taken in by her older cousin, Mordecai, who then becomes a father figure to her. So these are our 2 main characters of this story. We have Esther and we have Mordecai. We'll be mainly focusing on Esther, but the whole story really needs to be told to understand her actions and what she did, including mentioning her superhero sidekick, Mordecai. So I won't be obviously stopping to make individual points, but we're trying to tell the story throughout. However, the message I hope to convey throughout is this, that Esther is courageous, important, yet relatively ordinary. And above it all, God is in control. That is, Esther is courageous, important, yet relatively ordinary. And above it all, God is in control. Well, firstly, they are living in a kingdom of darkness. these two characters that we are looking at. They're living in a kingdom of darkness. God seems to be absent. I don't know if you've read the book of Esther, but this is the only book in the Bible that does not mention God at all, not one mention. The kingdom around them seems to only care about money and beauty and earthly things. It's an empire ruled by hedonism and aesthetics. And the Jews are left to wonder how to live for God in the midst of this earthly kingdom. Doesn't that sound like us now? We still live in the kingdom. Pleasure and looks still motivate the culture. There is still corruption in the mostly ungodly leadership. And God can seem to be largely not present nor in control. And until Jesus comes back and brings the new heaven and new earth and all things are reconciled and healed and justice is brought, we still live in that tension. Here then is a relatively ordinary setting in which they live. So what is the story of Esther? And I'd love to have a little graphic detail warning here. This story is not exactly PG, as you read from the very first line of the passage that was read out. And the passage that was read out falls in the middle of the story. The man in charge of the Persian Empire is a man named King Xerxes, and his second in command is a man named Haman. Haman is worshipped in fear by all of the people but one. Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. And once Haman hears about this and the fact that Mordecai is a Jew, he hatches a plan not just to kill Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews throughout the whole empire. So Haman casts lots, like rolling die, to try and work out a favorable day on which to kill all of the Jews. And then he easily manages to persuade this king to let him make a decree to go out to the corners of the empire to tell all people to annihilate the Jews on this single day. Here is a picture of horrific evil. A man attempting a genocide of the Jews out of fear, enormous pride, and hatred. Sadly, as those in the 21st century, we have seen or know about the events of the Holocaust, as well as other awful genocides of other ethnic and racial groups. So we can picture this all too well. How is Esther then involved in this story? Well, Esther started as nothing. She was an unmarried, orphaned girl. In this society and culture, she was a nobody, but she was taken in by Mordecai, an older relative. And meanwhile, in the royal palace, King Xerxes had just banished his previous wife for disobedience, and eventually he got lonely. So his advisors said he should gather all the most beautiful women in the kingdom and choose which one should be his wife. And Esther was one of these women that was taken. Now, when this story was presented to me as a child, this was presented as a beauty pageant. And all the less PG details were kind of shoved to the side, under the blanket, left unmentioned. But let's be honest here, this is sex trafficking. This is kidnapping. This is horrific. The word used in chapter 2, verse 8, if you're reading along, is taken. She didn't choose to go. She didn't sign up via the website with a cash prize for the beauty pageant. This is awful. Here then is a young woman with a painful past. Here is a woman who most likely had to do some things that went against the Jewish law in order to survive. And before we jump to perhaps question her moral integrity, or indeed Mordecai's for seemingly letting her go, this is not the point of the book. Firstly, we have no right to put judgment on them as equally fallen people ourselves. And secondly, if we stop at their wrongdoings, we miss out on all the ways that God will use these imperfect people to do extraordinary things. Here then are imperfect people with a painful past, a relatively ordinary story. Now, Mordecai had instructed her to keep her Jewish heritage a secret as she went to the king, and it seems God's favor was resting on Esther as she was the one chosen to be queen. Mordecai then soon finds out about Haman's decree to kill all the Jews throughout the whole empire, And then through Mordecai, so does Esther, as we read in the passage, and both are in utter despair along with all the Jews in the empire. So was there any hope? Was there anything they could do? Well, in chapter 4, verse 8, we see that Mordecai instructed Esther to go into the king's presence and to beg for mercy for her people's lives. It's a big ask for someone sitting in sackcloth and ashes outside the king's gate to one in royal robes in the king's courts. Yet he asks, and yet Esther remains humble enough to listen to the advice of this elder. Esther replies back through this messenger, who, to be honest, must have been pretty tired from running back and forth between Esther and Mordecai. But she tells Mordecai, everyone knows I'd be killed if I go before the king. For everyone who goes before the king uninvited will be killed unless he extends the golden scepter to them. And she hasn't seen the king in 30 days. It's not like they're proper tight. Mordecai probably knew all these things, and yet he replies, don't think you'll be spared even in your royal position. And he knows the promises God made to his people. When we talked about the bigger picture earlier, and I zoomed all the way out, we talked about that covenant that God made with Abraham and all his descendants. Mordecai knows that the deliverance of the Jews will arise from some place. Just maybe it won't be from Esther. But yet he says these incredibly important words to Esther. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And she replies. What does she say? She says she'll do it. That everyone should go and fast for 3 days, and she will fast too, and then she will go before the king, even if it gets her killed. Sadly, we have to stop the storytelling there and look back at those main points. And for each one, I'd love to look at women from today who exemplify these things. So the first point to make is Esther shows godly courage. We saw that in that passage there. She could stay silent. She could refuse to put on those royal robes. She could just stay in the harem with the eunuchs, but she chooses to be courageous, do something which could get her killed. This wasn't at all trivial, going before the king uninvited. She hadn't seen him in 30 days. And you know what? She was standing up for justice. She was standing up for racial justice, ethnic justice. But she does it. She gets the whole community to fast for 3 days, a sign that she knows she needs God for this moment. And then she puts on her royal robes, the position that God has put her in. She takes on that position. She doesn't let it go. She takes on that position, the sphere of influence she's been put in, and she approaches the king's inner court. A person I would love to look at who exemplifies this courage. This is Bae. It may not be her name or picture, but she is an exile in North Korea. She was exiled from her community that she lived in because she owned a Bible. She was found with a Bible, and she was exiled to another community to do backbreaking labor. Yet she continues to run an underground church in hushed whispers in their houses. This is incredible courage for something that could easily get her killed. If you want to find out more about her story, have a look at the Open Doors website. It is incredible. The second thing I want to say is Esther's importance in this story. She is key to this story. As Mordecai says, what if she's been put in this position for such a time as this? And I believe that is exactly what God did. Put her exactly there, exactly where he wanted her for such a time as this. She's also a female type or image of Christ. She approaches the throne of a man who is in many ways painted like God, for the language of entering his presence is the same as used in Psalms for God. He has unchangeable laws. If you enter in his courts like the Holy of Holies, like the tabernacle, while being uninvited, you most likely will die. And yet she risks her life to save God's people. She's being portrayed a bit like Christ. This all points to Jesus, the one who not only risked death, but embraced it. in order to save his people, with no hint of a selfish reason, but only out of love. To be one and a woman in this culture who is another big arrow in the Old Testament pointing to Jesus shows us much more of her importance. For this point, I would love to mention someone who many of you will know and was a member of this church, Kate Carew. She invited the youth in this church into her house for many years and continued to do so, despite the pain of losing her husband, Patrick. Now these youth are young adults across the country serving God in different ways. She had such an importance in my story and in many others in this youth. And here's a picture of many of us on the screen. And I don't doubt that I am here today in no small part due to her. Just like Chris was saying when we're talking about Lighthouse, I don't doubt that the small things that people are doing at Lighthouse that are impacting people's lives will lead on to great things that they will do for God. And most of all, I want to say that Esther is an ordinary individual who did extraordinary things. She was no superhero. She came from nothing, but God used her to do extraordinary things. Some people, I've been studying at Oxford for a few years, and some people there that have been inspiring me in my faith are many of the female students in the church. So many of them have been inviting their friends like every week to church and praying persistently for them, and they saw the fruit of that perseverance. Their persistence in praying felt quite ordinary, but the transformation in their friends was anything but ordinary, very much extraordinary. It was in God's timing, though, and the hearts were totally melted in God's control. One of my friends kept praying every week, kept inviting them every week, and it was only right at the end of term that they came. And only on the very last week where they came again, they were prayed for, and they said, "Do you know what? I think I want to give this a go." That is incredible. God is sovereignly in control in this story too, in the story of Esther. A bit of a spoiler, because we didn't cover the rest of the story, but the Jews are saved miraculously through a series of coincidences. Like the king has this sleepless night, and then he's woken up and he chooses to read a bedtime story to him, and it happens to be the right one that makes all of the saving of the Jews possible. And if you don't get me, I'd encourage you to go read the last 6 chapters of Esther and to read the whole story. It doesn't take that long. See, despite God being mentioned in this passage, in the whole of the book, that is a clue for us to look out of all the coincidences of where he is working. It helps us to see that when we can't see God in our own lives, we should be looking for where he is working. See, in the sleeplessness, in the dreams, in the reading, in the dice rolls that Haman thought he had control, but God was planning the right dates. It was all God in control, sovereignly control above it all. So where has God placed you for such a time as this? What spheres of influence has he placed you in? What justice could be sought in your workplace, in your family, in your areas that you go about your daily life? Where could God use you despite your painful story or in your painful story? Where could you faithfully do your bit and trust God for the rest as Esther did? Where can you do extraordinary things for God? I'd love to turn into a time of prayer ministry now. If those who are on the prayer team would like to head up. And just in this moment, it'd be great for you to just think about if God is nudging you in any way of any areas of your life where you could stand up for something, or that you could trust him more, or you could do your little bit and see him do the rest, where he wants to say, yes, I can use you as an ordinary person, but to do extraordinary things with him. Or perhaps you were really touched by Bay's story and you want to be praying for the Christians who are persecuted, just like Esther and Mordecai in this story, or Bay out in North Korea, or many other areas of the world. Yeah, I'd love to invite anyone who feels God is moving in their heart to come up for prayer. If there is some area of your life you want some help in. You see that Esther didn't do it alone. She said, I'm going to talk to the community. All of them are going to fast and pray for me. This isn't something that we do alone. This isn't something that we run as a race by ourselves. So I'd encourage you, if any of you have been touched by any of those things, that do come up and ask someone for prayer.